Okay, so my background's in trial management. I've got about 20 years of designing and managing trials and communicating with lots of different people. And as Frances said, I'm going to try and give you kind of an overview really of things to think about from a communication perspective when we're thinking about trial management. So briefly, what I'm going to cover today is just thinking through why good communication skills are so key for a trial manager and the types of communication that the trial managers are involved in. Really thinking about the importance of knowing your audience, a little bit of a offshoot of thinking about the trial as a business, and I'll explain why as we go through, and then communicating with and motivating sites, and importantly, planning communication. So when I talk about trial managers in this talk, I'm really referring to anyone working in a trial management team, to be honest, since the principles really remain the same. And excellent communication skills are just one of those essential skills that you need as a trial manager. Absolutely essential in order to run the trial and keep everybody motivated along the way. And that skill, therefore, understandably features in the majority of trial manager job descriptions. So you can see on the slide an extract from the National Institute of Health Research generic job description for a trial manager. It's recently been updated by the UK Trial Managers Network, and that would feature in lots of trial manager job descriptions because it's such a key part of the role. So why are excellent communication skills so essential when you're a trial manager? Well, the trial manager really plays that pivotal role in the trial. They're essentially the kind of go-to person in the trial. They're involved in almost every aspect. And that means they've got to communicate with lots of different people and juggle lots of different things. And I'll just give you a few examples now. So most importantly, trial participants, patients, patient and public involvement representatives, and any kind of wider charities or community groups that you might want to engage with. The team themselves, so communicating with what are sometimes really large teams. So the chief investigator and the many co-investigators and the many members of the research teams. These teams could be huge, so there are a lot of people to talk to and communicate with. The various groups and committees who might give approvals or have oversight of your trial. And then the research sites in terms of the team, which again may be large and involve the principal investigator, research nurses, and then the R&D department, and then a whole host of other support departments dependent on your trial. And of course, there are likely to be many more people that you need to communicate with, dependent on the specifics of the trial. So some of you may have seen the communication wheel that's recently been developed by members of the communications subgroup of the Trial Conduct Working Group in the Trials Methodology Research Partnership. It's a bit of a mouthful. And Frances presented this at the methodology conference in Harrogate last month. But this really nicely maps out the various stages of the trial life cycle and who should be involved in every stage. And of course, the trial manager is involved in almost all of these stages, and they certainly would be responsible for communicating with many, if not all of these stakeholder groups that have been identified. So it's a really nice way to just kind of thinking, mapping it out and seeing how kind of involved the trial manager is in all of this. And if we think about the types of communication that the trial manager might be involved in, that's also really wide-ranging, and it can include a whole range of formal or informal types of communication. I'm not going to read through the examples that are on this slide, but you can certainly see the variety, I hope. And having good communication skills here is absolutely key. You know, things that are poorly communicated, it can obviously lead to issues. So, for example, if the protocol is not clearly communicated, it could lead to problems with processes being undertaken incorrectly. It could compromise the integrity of the trial, compromise patient safety. If the participant information sheet's unclear and it's full of waffle, it might not be clear to patients what they're asking to take part in, could affect recruitment into the trial. or if training material to sites is not communicated clearly and robustly, that again could compromise the quality of the trial. Ultimately, all of those things could lead to the research question being unanswered, which is obviously wasteful and unethical. So I guess the basic message here is that trial managers are involved in communicating almost anything and everything to do with the trial, and therefore absolutely essential that they do that well. So how might they communicate? Well, in terms of the formats of communication that they might use. Well, I guess it broadly falls under 3 categories, but the key here for me is really thinking about what you're communicating and who you're communicating it with, and thinking through what the best format for them might be, not necessarily for you. So the first of those is verbal communication, and here I can't overemphasize the importance of that in this kind of increasing digital age where we rely upon electronic methods so much, that talking to someone is often just the most effective and efficient way to get your message across. And if we're thinking about verbal communication, that could be really quite formal, like giving a presentation about the trial at a site initiation visit, or communicating the findings of the trial, or it could be really informal, just like picking up the phone to a member of the team at site and finding out what's going on at site, and that's really key and important. Written communication, of course, can take on lots of different forms, and again can be really informal or very formal. Obviously, when you're being informal, you should always remain professional, but the way in which you communicate about your trial in a safety report to the regulators, for example, would be really different, I would hope, to you giving an update about your trial on a social media channel. And if we think about social media, I think it's really important that people take time to really think about using it properly and how you can use it to potentially to your advantage in the trial. I know Southampton Clinical Trials Unit have done some great work in this area. They've developed some tools and digital kind of resources that are available to help people with this kind of a bit of a newer area, I guess. You obviously need to think about the language you're using there and try and cut out the research waffle that I think we all tend to use a bit without really thinking about. And I guess we just all need to stop and think before we just blindly communicate. And then finally, increasingly people are using multimedia for a variety of different purposes. That might include short videos, animations, podcasts. And again, the way in which you'll communicate using those formats will be quite different to if you're writing a more formal report, for example. So I think if I could give you one take-home message from this talk, it's this, that you really need to take the time to know who your target audience is. As a trial manager, you've got so many different people to communicate with. It's really easy to forget that. But you need to think about who you're communicating with, what formats will work best for them, and the type of language you use, whether you need to be more technical, for example, or more kind of writing or talking in plain English. And with that in mind, I just want to give a mention talk about plain English, and was thinking about that we should all aim to talk in plain English to everyone. I think many people assume that lay language or plain English language is only relevant if we're communicating something to participants or patients or members of the public. And in actual fact, and that's obviously important, but in actual fact, we should always aim to communicate in plain English with whoever we're trying to talk to and communicate with. You know, as the trial manager, you live and breathe your trial every day. You'll know it inside out and back to front. Lots of other people won't know the trial in that level of detail, and you shouldn't assume that they do. So it's really important, therefore, that you communicate with clarity. So if you've not seen these resources already, the Plain English campaign was set up a number of years ago, but it's got some great resources just to help people really break things down. So some very practical guidance that just helps you to stop and think about clear communication, including a very simply named How to Write in Plain English guide. And I'd also recommend that if you're writing something relatively complex, which as a trial manager you often are, that you try and read it aloud. Sometimes that reading aloud will make you see it in a slightly different way. And I've often found that as a kind of a helpful tip to making my writing a bit clearer. If we think about clarity, one thing that I think we're probably all quite bad at, including trial managers, is talking in acronyms. And I think we should all try and just avoid that at all costs. So if someone said, I'd like to talk to you about PPI to a member of the public, would they think I meant payment protection insurance? If I said the same thing to a doctor, would they think I meant a proton pump inhibitor, which is a type of drug for reducing stomach acid? In actual fact, I might have been talking about patient and public involvement, which many in this audience now, I'm sure, probably would have assumed. But of course, that's just one example. There are lots more. I think we often use acronyms when we're talking to people who understand what those acronyms mean. But then because we're doing that, it becomes such a habit that we don't notice ourselves doing it. And that means that we then drop acronyms into communications with lots of other people who are less familiar, and that can lead to confusion. So I think it's probably just advisable that to try and stop doing it altogether. So I'm going to change tack a little bit now, and I want to talk to you about the concept of treating trials as a business. Now, not in the sense of profit making at all, not in the sense of kind of conducting commercial trials, but more around the fact that a business is in effect selling a product or a service to people. Now, as a trial manager who's communicating with so many different people at different time points about different things, one of the key roles of a trial manager is essentially to sell the trial to lots of different audiences. Now, that might be the funder, might be ethics committee, might be healthcare professionals, sites, patients and participants. So several years ago, some work was done that was led by Alison MacDonald in Aberdeen, and they looked at using a business model approach and marketing techniques in non-commercial clinical trials. And they worked with somebody with expertise in business techniques, and they developed this framework that you can see on the slide now, of all the areas to think about in a trial that could kind of roughly map onto the same types of things that you'd be thinking about from a business perspective. And of note here, if we're thinking about communication, are achieving buy-in and delivering a multi-audience, multi-level message. And that speaks to the point I was making earlier about really knowing your audience, and as a trial manager, communicating with all those different people on different levels. And both of those are hugely important if you want your trial to be a success. And of course, by success, I mean in terms of answering your research question, not that your intervention was necessarily shown to be effective. You know, I genuinely believe we've got lots to learn from different disciplines outside of clinical trials and science generally. So I'm going to give a shameless plug to a paper that we published earlier this year in Trials. The QR code's on the screen now if you're interested in reading it. But we were working, so my colleague and I in Nottingham with Sean Truique up in Aberdeen and a marketing professor in Nottingham, really thinking about techniques that are used in marketing and businesses that might really be important for clinical trials. And of course, communication is a real key part of marketing and business. And that's an area that we want to explore a little bit more. So for trial managers who are involved in managing multi-centre trials, communicating with those sites is absolutely essential. If you're not in regular communication with your sites, you've really got a problem. And if we think about the business model for a moment, imagine you're running a wholesale business where you might be supplying a product to 50 customers. And for you to make that business a success, you need to communicate with those customers. You need to think of how you're going to get their custom in the first place, and then importantly, maintain their custom. And in my opinion, that's very much the same as the trial manager building and maintaining a relationship with your sites. So you can see on the framework that I showed you previously, I've highlighted those key areas that are relevant to communication and are particularly relevant to site communication. And as I said earlier, the trial will be at the forefront of the trial manager's mind, but that won't be the case for everybody. So some sites might be running multiple studies, and it's very easy that things can just go to the back of somebody's mind because they're juggling so many different things. So you really need to build a relationship with key staff at the site. And obviously you need to be really personable and friendly to do that. You know, often trials might have a generic mailbox, for example, so that multiple people can have access to it and respond to different queries from sites. But that sometimes can feel a little bit hidden. So it's really important, just very simple things like make sure you reply with your name. You're building up that relationship with key people at the sites. Some trials can take a long time to run, and people can lose a bit of motivation across the entire team. And the trial manager's job is to really kind of keep that motivation and maintain that long-term relationship with them. So trial managers might do that via newsletters, other short forms of communication about the trial, holding investigator meetings. It might be things like sending certificates out to sites who are doing well, to say thank you, or sending small tokens of appreciation. All of those are kind of really important in motivating and maintaining relationships with sites. And I said earlier about, you know, it's at the forefront of the trial manager's mind, but even the wider research teams themselves, because they might be working on multiple trials, can forget the detail about a trial. So the trial manager, when they're communicating information about the trial, really needs to assume that people don't remember everything. They can very easily forget. So it's important to give context and really explain a situation without making assumptions that people can remember something that may have happened several months ago. And I mentioned earlier the value of verbal communication, but I guess with sites, I can't overemphasize the importance of still picking up the phone. I think we're all so used to now receiving multiple messages via email, chats on different platforms like Teams or Zoom, and that can result in lots and lots of messages going back and forth. And sometimes for efficiency, the best method is really just to be kind of go back to basics, pick up the phone, have a chat with someone. It helps maintain that relationship as well, and it can often nip things in the bud pretty quickly. So I've talked about why trial managers should make sure that they're really excellent communicators, but what happens when poor communication creeps in? Well, frankly, it could be disastrous. You know, they do play that real kind of pivotal part in the trial. So poor communication can lead to delays in the trial. That might be during the setup period or whilst the trial's being conducted. And of course, more time usually means more money somewhere along the line. It can also lead to mistrust, both from kind of within the research community and within the patient and members of the public community. You know, if people feel that they have been miscommunicated with previously and the communication wasn't clear and concise, they might not trust the individual in the future or the trial, and that can obviously have knock-on effects. I guess at best, it can just lead to people being confused and having a lack of understanding about what they're being told. And if we communicate poorly with sites and potential participants, that can really affect our ability to recruit and retain participants in the trial. So I've hopefully demonstrated to you that the trial manager plays a key role in much of this, but there's also a lot for the trial manager to think about and a lot to remember. So one thing that that could be helpful is trial managers having a communication planning right from the outset. So that would clearly outline on paper who you're due to communicate with. There will obviously be many, many people in different roles, when that should happen. You know, obviously for some people it will depend on their role, and finally how you should communicate, as in the type and format of communication that I was talking about earlier. And I think it's really helpful to formalise some of this, not least because it's just, there's so much to juggle as a trial manager, but it can also be really helpful when you've got particularly large teams. And often there may be 3, 4, 5 or more people working on a trial just from a trial management team, irrespective of the wider team, who you obviously need to work closely with. But you all need to know who you're communicating with, when and how, just to avoid things slipping through the net. But even more importantly, there are obviously sometimes inevitable changes in research teams. People leave, things get changed around. When that happens, people who are new to the team don't obviously have all that background and intel that you'll have picked up previously. So having a simple communication planning can also help with handovers and kind of changes in the team as well. So in summary, hopefully you can see that excellent communication is a key skill for trial managers, and that they play that pivotal role in communicating with everybody in the trial, and that the types of communication really do vary, and you need to tailor what you say and how you say it. A kind of plea for us all to try and avoid jargon always, no matter who the audience are, and really give communication proper attention as a trial manager, and plan it fully. And just to finish, I just wanted to mention a couple of resources that people might find helpful. So first is the UK Trial Managers Network Guide to Efficient Trial Management, and there are kind of mentions about communication throughout that guide. And that's currently in its 6th version and is undergoing an update at the moment, which we're hoping will be published next year. And then the Communications Handbook for Clinical Trials. So this is in book format, but freely available online. And although it tends to focus more on the site perspective of communication, there is some really useful stuff in there as well. So thank you very much for listening. Obviously happy to answer questions.